like to introduce Sin Yong Lu, Director at Infocom Media Development Authority Singapore, Daniel Curtis, STS Task Force. Daniel is Head of Strategic Policy and Regulatory Reform at the Simplified Trade System Implementation Task Force with the Australian Government. Ashley Bell. Ashley is the Assistant Secretary for Customs and Border Modernisation in the Australian Border Force. Steve Capel. Steve is the Project Leader for the United Nations Centre for Trade Facilitation and Electronic Business, UN CFACT. Adam Stringmore, Standards Australia. Adam is the General Manager, Engagement and Communications, Standards Australia. And our facilitator is Peter Carter, DS1. Peter, would you like to take the floor, please?
And thank you so much. And Vincent, what a fantastic presentation. It's, I will say, very unusual that we have so many applauses and hand raises, etc., through the session. So congratulations, you've obviously struck a few great notes. I would encourage everyone on the call, take a photograph of this screen in front of you right now, because we have a remarkable group of very influential people and experienced specialists in the area of verifiable credentials today. I've got a few questions. We're going to run through probably until about 20 past. So I'll try and keep it lively. If you do have additional questions, please pop them in the chat channel or the Q&A, and we will certainly try to get to them. I'd like to open the question to Vincent, and perhaps I'd like to focus on government initially. So I might ask Daniel and Ash Bell from Australian Border Force also. The question is, how does the current strategy in US Customs align with Australian Border Force programs and the simplified trade system? Perhaps we could open the conversation. Vincent, if you'd like to start, or Daniel or Ashley.
Yeah, it may be a little difficult for Vincent to answer how his work aligns with ours. So perhaps if Ash and I talk first, and Vincent might be able to draw some connections. Hi everyone, Dan Curtis from Simplified Trade System Task Force. For those who haven't come across us, we're a whole of government task force, Australian government. Our mandate is working across Australian government agencies and co-designing with business to simplify cross-border trade, working across regulation, data, and digital. We've been working closely with business and across government to develop an end-to-end view of the import and export process for both Australian businesses and our international trading partners, and working across government with industry to develop a plan for the future state of trade and working to draw a global best practice as well. It's been fantastic to hear from Vincent today and look forward to hearing from our other experts too. We're really at the point we're working on a simpler joined-up experience for Australian business. We're really keen to facilitate innovation in the private sector and leverage data where it exists, and that's really as something that I drew from Vincent's presentation. The team sport of data, really part of our approach. The Australian government has certain requirements when it comes to data. There are things we want to know about as they cross the border, but we're not the experts on the commercial data that businesses hold, or we don't control the entire supply chain. So we really want to work with and understand commercial processes and the opportunity to leverage that innovation. Some of the work that we've done so far in terms of traceability. So we've been joining up efforts across Australian Agriculture Department and Australian Border Force, and this has included funding a significant traceability and credentials ecosystem stream of work through the agriculture portfolio, as well as some of the initiatives that Ashley will talk about. And we've also been working on development of a trade data sharing framework, which we've got out for consultation at the moment. I think perhaps if I were to draw two more parallels to Vincent's presentation, firstly, we really do want to go to where business data is, and where we've certainly heard from industry there's not a lot of interest in developing new portals or particular solutions that require business to come to us We need to go to where the business information is, and also the point you made, Vincent, about adaptive, regular innovation, regular release, and not a set and forget approach. Is certainly part of the reforms that we're taking forward. So I might, if it's all right with Peter, hand over to Ashley to talk a bit about what she's doing.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Peter and GS1 for inviting me, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you on the Ngunnawal and Ngambri land today as we talk about traceability, data sharing, verifiable credentials, all of the exciting stuff. It was a fantastic presentation, Vincent, and I think to Peter's question, the thing that strikes me the most is just how much we're managing and dealing with the same challenges. And, you know, when I look at the initial slide that Vincent joined, that wonderful little squiggly line, and I'm sure it's even more complex than that of dotted lines of data, is exactly the trophy that we're hunting. You know, I think at the sense, the more interoperable our systems are, the more connected globally, the more transparency that we have, the role of regulators becomes a lot easier. The way that we can then get out of the way of industry, but maintain those strong border protection requirements is what we're trying to do. So we are, like the US, looking at trade modernization across a range of vectors as part of the broader whole of government effort that Daniel spoke to. I've just recently come back from meeting with a number of Vincent's colleagues in customs border protection, but on a different angle, which is looking at data, which is around image sharing and how do you take scanned images from different countries, how do you share that, how you develop algorithms. So the connections across administrations on trade modernization are very entrenched. And similarly, we've done close work with Singapore, both on broader data work, but also specifically on this issue of verifiable credentials. A couple of things, I guess, that sort of sung to me from Vince's presentation was really about some of the challenges of the movement of technology. I really like that idea of focusing around standards rather than specific technology, rather than locking in vendor-specific parts. We had a similar challenge with our own platform that I'll talk to in a second around the use of blockchain. Now, I think blockchain sort of seems to have gotten a bit of a reputation now, but certainly when we were looking at the proof of concept trial, it was an element where we were looking at it as a potential technology solution. But since then, similar to the US, we had challenges about scalability, cost, efficiency. And so we've looked at different kinds of technology. And obviously, a key thing for us has been ensuring that we are, you know, consistent with the WC3 standards as a priority, so that we have platforms that are able to be picked up by other countries, by businesses, and actually start to connect into that dotted landscape. To the point that Dan raises again, the other one is that team border data. I think that's a perfect way of looking at it. And I think in our space, one of the big challenges that we're looking at where there's a lot of alignment is this idea of paperless trade. I do think that this is a more challenging concept because it's not just an issue for government to solve, right? In the trade system, we know some of the paper there is around trust between business to business links, right? It's about, you know, commercial papers that government doesn't actually see. And so it does then become a problem for us to solve together. It does become an opportunity for us then to leverage technology, to leverage these standards, and to have discussions like we're having today that are going to support us to crack the back of what is a really complex policy issue. But I guess just to quickly talk about the Australian context, one of the big initiatives we've had in this space is the digital verification platform. So some of you would have heard about that. The ABF has been taking this forward to enable creation and use of trusted digital trade documents. Now, this is focused on the component that Vincent was talking about around verifiable credentials for, you know, the verification of the authenticity of the documents. So not necessarily in the data sharing world, although that was very exciting to hear about the work that the US is doing, and certainly something I'm sure my team will be keen to engage more closely on. But this is around how we're able to trust the documents and how we can do that in an easier way, so that, you know, should paper be required, we've got a QR code that connects back and anchors to the ABF to say, yep, that document is not tampered with, it is what it is, no problems. And then we build in machine-to-machine elements. We've also got kind of smartphone elements. So it's one of these things where we're looking at the usability of the technology, but we're also ensuring that the platform we build has been built on an open architecture plan. And to Vincent's point, the idea is that we want these standards out there. We want to show what we're doing. We're not holding on to it, and we're certainly not trying to narrow the use of this platform. Probably to close out, I'm happy to talk more about DVP if there's specific questions, but I think for us, what we found was that not using these internationally accepted standards would have meant that any kind of digital development we did would have been a dead end. Using these verifiable credentials and using this work has allowed us to be able to expand our idea of what DVP can do and have a greater number of industry, government, and international partners. So it is an exciting piece of work and something that we're really keen to share and talk more about. But I might pause there.
Yeah, look, Ash, thank you for that. And Daniel, I think you've got the quote of the day so far as data as a team sport, and we'll probably keep coming back to that analog. Before we pass on, I'd like to move to a conversation about what does this mean for exporters and our trade partners. But just before I go there, Vince, if you had any comments or reflections on what Daniel and Ashley had to say from the US perspective, but also would you mind just quietly how excited are you about what you're seeing happen around verifiable credentials? You know, of your 3 decades worth of wrangling technology and technologists, where do you see this sitting in the order of excitement, if you like?
For me, I'm not going to speak on behalf of the agency right now. It's the biggest change I've ever seen in the supply chain arena in my career, because we simply haven't been able to do what we're accomplishing right now through automation. We've always talked about it in some sense of the word, but never been able to get there. So Peter, you know, what's interesting is by the way, I am not against scanned images or paper. I don't want anybody to think that. I'm an innovation specialist, so I have to go and take risk. And that's what I would really like to encourage everybody to do. And I see Australia doing that as well. They're willing to go out there and take risks. And, you know, I've been working with some of the Border 5 components as well. And they're willing to test these things out to see what the art of the possible is. I have a very silly expression that I use with my team. And I say, sometimes, you know, you got to shoot for the stars. And with the government, if you fall among the trees, you're in good shape, because at least you got further, you know, and that's ultimately what we're after. The thing is that the risks that we are taking are producing results, and we're able to do the tracking that we never dreamed we would be able to. And I know right away we can't get rid of all paper, but imagine a world where we could. And we're on that road to doing that. And think about, just for a second, what the potential is for artificial intelligence when you're in an all completely digital world. It's just a phenomenal step into a new reality, and the supply chain can get there. We just got to get past the unwillingness of those who don't want to change because they're comfortable. So I'll leave it at that.
Vincent, thank you. And getting rid of paper certainly has to tick a few boxes around the simplified trade systems agenda, one would think. But what you've done is created a beautiful segue to a second line of questions, which is really concentrating on our exporters and traders and our trading partners. So I'd like to invite Diane and Sing Yong. If I could, Sing Yong's been doing some real heavy lifting. The government of Singapore really focused on the digitalisation of trade documents. I suppose my question to you both is that verifiable credentials is still a fairly new concept for some. So what sort of challenges do we envisage in terms of government and industry just understanding what this world might look like, and what are the practical implications for people who are moving containers backwards and forwards?
Would Sonia like to go first? I'm happy to make a comment. It's very simple processes to do exports to some areas and not to others. It depends on the rules and regulations in different countries. And I think that's the biggest challenge. It's the verifiable credentials, the data collection still has to work with standards, with harmonized standards, still has to work with the laws in different countries. the shipping lines have different requirements for bills of ladings in different countries. There's a whole lot of things that need to be considered. So it's not as simple as just saying let's go on to, you know, a verifiable credential system, which is really advancing the idea of our paper documents that we use to identify things in the past. So there's a lot more to do. I think it's the future. I think it needs to match the pace with what's happening rest of the world. One of the things I find really frustrating, and it is moving ahead and doing it quite well, but the banking system in the trade area is still very old-fashioned, if I dare say that in front of anyone. The use of paper, the use of querying documents, all of those sorts of things. Now there are experiments in blockchain and different systems to try and alleviate that. But we're a long way from any progressive results, really great results that'll work consistently. So, you know, there's a lot of work to do, but we need to keep pace with the idea of verifiable credentials, the idea of data collection, the idea of digitalizing everything we're doing. But it is just going to be a slow process. The more we educate, the more we advise, and the more we work with people like Standards Australia and ABF and the US Customs to try and have a more harmonized approach to all of this, the better and easier it's going to be.
Thanks, Diane. Sing-Yong, what's your lessons and advice based on the experience over the last few years, please?
Let me unmute. Thanks for having me here. In fact, standardization and interoperability, I heard many repetition of these two now during our discussion today. In fact, when we first deal with trade, when I first deal with trade digitalization some 30 years ago, standardization has always been there. And of course, during that time, we didn't talk about interoperability, but the effort to standardize how you transmit data from one system to another, at that time, EDI was the biggest thing, right? And 30 years later, I'm still trying to remove the done paper. The speaker before me has shared a lot of experience. What is the latest, greatest? In fact, for Singapore, we have been using idea of verifiable credentials since 2016, where our Institute of Higher Learning started to issue their diploma and university degree as well as transcript in a way that allow any third party to reliably verify, right? You can imagine at that time, we can't use the term verifiable credential to describe. And I need to spend at least a week to actually explain to people how this concept can be applied to international trade. So I think it boils down to really, you come to think about it, it's about change management. And to really digitize international trade is really not about technology. It has got a lot to do with change management, education, and we all know policy always lag behind innovation, right? I give you an example. I've been trying to convince some of my agency here to use verifiable credential for photosanitary certificate. Guess what? The policy that they sign up to, I think ISPF 12, if I still, ISPM 12. Specifically say they have to use XML. And it was published in 2017, right? This is one. The other also, many years ago, I always think, hey, this is the greatest, paper is bad, digitalization is good. But I came to realize when you deal with international trade, we also need to be recognize that international trade typically involve parties in a very long chain. And the underlying assumption of most of the trade digitalization project that I've worked on always assume that everyone have the same standard of digitalization capability and they can digitize overnight. But we know after so many years of trying, it's not true. So that's why whichever methods or approach or technology that we put in place need to be flexible enough to cater for those small organization that has got maybe lesser digital maturity compared to those with high digital maturity. and provide them a path to reaching the star. I think that's important. I think showing them the star is one first step. And most importantly, we need to show the path towards the star. And a lot of education, a lot of evangelization is always required.
Sin Yong, I think you've shared a lot of wisdom, and it was a similar message that you conveyed at the Simplified Trade Systems Summit, that emphasising the change management involved and the importance and the opportunity that these new innovations provide in navigating single window conversations, recognising that some of our trade partners may not enjoy the same level of technical maturity, the ability to be able to play this new game of data exchange with our existing trading partners, irrespective of their digital maturity, certainly seems like a compelling opportunity. Thank you both for that. And we might loop back again, because I think trying to understand the implications of verifiable credentials in the context of single window conversations, I think is still a mystery for some, is trying to work out, do these things help or do they hinder? Are they yin and yang? Or we might get back to that in a minute. But just back to Daniel's analogy about the team sport of data, Steve Capel and Adam Singemore from Standards Australia. Steve, I often talk about verifiable credentials as a ball, as like a type of ball, a new type of ball that encapsulates some standardized data packets. And the beauty of this ball is we can throw it to people and they can share it around, etc. My question is, how do we make sure that it's one thing to build these new balls, but what if no one's ready to catch them? What do we need to do to help build the capability and the understanding to manage this change process that Sin Yong has mentioned, and building the capability of trading partners as well? Maybe Steve, if you could start, and then over to Adam.
Look, I think there's two major things that government can do to build capability, and I'll get to them after a little preamble, maybe about what I think some of the main drivers are that are actually outside government. And I just wanted to introduce the thing I'm seeing around the world at the UN, at various countries, and the industry forum I'm attending all over Australia, is a very, very dramatic uplift in concern around environmental and social governance, and the need for supply chains to prove that their environmental and social claims are true. It used to be that somebody would put a green logo on a box. It's really a marketing exercise. And the evidence now is that 70–80% of those are fake or misleading. The consequence of that is that regulators are stepping in with greenwashing regulation, things like EU Digital Product Passport. Activists are taking Delta Airlines to court because they say they're carbon neutral, when in fact it's based on rubbish offsets that are valueless. So the world is changing, and large corporates are starting to demand, in order that they can satisfy their own board, evidence that the claims from their supply chain are true. So this is a driver for traceability and transparency. And I think, if you look at things like the International Standards Accounting Standards Board, that for decades now has said how corporates publish their corporate financial accounts, they're now publishing rules for social and environmental governance criteria. And large corporates will start to do that seriously, and they will push those demands down onto their supply chain. And so that's going to impact millions of small and medium enterprises who suddenly faced with pressure to provide evidence for the claims with their products. And the consequence will be either they do that, or they may be increasingly excluded from markets. So I think this is really a key driver. And when you look at how you might do that, so that's why and what, but how, yes, verifiable credentials are part of it. I think most people in the supply chain wouldn't know how to spell verifiable credentials, and probably it wouldn't matter in future if they don't either, right? It's going to be systems that support that for them. But it's important because it's scalable, right? Back to your balls analogy, integrating a technical system to another technical system takes time and money. It's taken, I think, the Department of Agriculture 10 years to get 10 governments connected from with phytosanitary connections. But the nice thing about verifiable credentials is you don't actually need to integrate systems. You just pass data with the goods along the supply chain in a portable bundle. And that's what makes it really, really scalable. So it's quite an exciting technology for that purpose. And two, I think when ESG drives that behavior and when tooling is in place to support it and supply chains become more traceable and transparent, then that's an opportunity for customs. I don't think customs will drive this. I think ESG will drive this, but I think customs will benefit from this because it allows us to rethink the regulatory model and say, well, instead of going and reading that room full of documents and making a self-assessment of your obligations and reporting to government, we now have the ability to just inspect a transparent supply chain and ask, as government, what does that mean the obligations are on the reporting party? As Vincent was hinting at, use the data to answer the regulatory intent rather than getting the party to understand the regulation and report. So it's a great opportunity, I think, to rethink the way border regulation works. Back to the two things I think government needs to do to help, not just with their own regulatory compliance, but with this whole export market access and industry support to comply with ESG requirements is one, act as you do today. Government is really what I might call a trust anchor. They issue all kinds of credentials like identity, police checks, trusted traders, mostly as bits of paper. If you think about a digital traceability chain, it's full of claims, mostly made by intermediaries like shippers or traders. How do you trust those claims as the verifier at the end of the chain? The answer is if they're anchored in something you trust. In other words, if I'm an exporter issuing an invoice, that's one thing. But if I can prove that my decentralized identity is linked to an ABF attested trusted trader credential, then the verifier can say, not only is this a valid invoice, but it comes from an ABF accredited trusted trader. That gives me much more confidence that I can trust it, right? So there's all kinds of things government already does as part of its natural business that largely results in the issuing of a piece of paper that says, yes, you're a trusted trader, or the police have checked you, or whatever it is. Just do that digitally, right? That's the step number one, because everything else will anchor on that. And that's what will add trust to the traceability chain. And I'd say we're 1% of the way on that journey at best at the moment. So a long way to go. The second thing government should do is to recognize that, we're having this conversation and there are people here who have been around this for a while, but the awareness of the impacts of the ESG controls and other things is very, very low across industry. There are millions of SMEs that are going to be impacted. And I think there's no way a small team is going to reach out to all those, right? So what's the capability and capacity building strategy that we need? I think it's through industry associations who already have the trust of their members. So the question for government and groups above that is, how can we empower communities who in turn empower their community members to adopt and ride and get pulled along really on this journey? I think it's going to take quite a lot of capability and capacity building effort, but I think government and certain institutions, GS1 being one of them, need to collaborate on to answer that question. I think there's about 2,000 industry associations in Australia. How have we begun the journey to uplift them so that they can uplift their members? Again, I think the answer is we're lucky if it's at 1%. So we've got a long way to go on that.
Steve, I think that's a great call to action challenge, in fact, and it's a good segue to pass to Adam, because I know Standards Australia have been working actively throughout the ASEAN region, focusing on capacity building in the area of digital trade standards. So, Adam, what are your thoughts in terms of, what else needs to be done to build the capacity of our trading partners here as well?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think there's two elements here. The first is obviously capacity or capability and an understanding of the problem that we're trying to solve. But the second piece is very much incentives based. So governments are loath to spend money without the right incentives, and the private sector even more so. And if we want to have a really good push here then I think there's a little bit of work to be done in defining the business problem, not necessarily the architecture or the standards numbers that we'd use or the deep sets of detail. It's very much the business problem. And then making sure that as we go on this journey, and the Border 5 work is incredibly important here to show that if we invest, then there's going to be some return. And so I think the call out here is there's a capability and there's an understanding piece, and there's a nomenclature piece. There's a set of language that we all should be using, right, to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. And then beyond that, Steve was right to call out ESG as a really strong driver here. The modern slavery stuff, the embodied carbon stuff, there's real drivers now for change. And the private sector, when they're faced with increasing reporting requirements, which are real and that cannot be fudged, their incentives start to change. So to sort of summarize, I think there's a capability and an understanding piece that's really, really important. Then there's an incentives piece, and I think that case is made. And then there's a job for us all to keep talking about the business problems that we're trying to solve and not talking about our proprietary standards or technical specs or things that nobody else understands, to bring all of those industry associations and private sector players on the journey with us.
Adam, thank you for that. There's a consistent message coming through here around language, around incentives and the change management, and keeping focusing on the problem that we're trying to define. Steve, I do love the idea that people don't need to actually understand what a verifiable credential is or does to be able to use it. I mean, that's at least a great place to start. Could I perhaps just loop back to the question? One of the things that people often want to know is that, how does an innovation like this impact what the WTR have been working on around single window? Is it maybe to Daniel and to Sin Yong and Vincent, if you feel like throwing your perspective in on this, is it aligned? Is it a different direction? Is it the same thing? Can we achieve what WTR are hoping to achieve faster, better with verifiable credentials, or is it a different approach? Daniel, do you want to start this one?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And I'm certainly not an expert on WTO, but I think we thought a lot about, for example, trade facilitation agreement, which has some excellent developments, but it's also 10 years old in the world. I think we've learned a lot about supply chains, technology, and what's possible, and that innovation is going to continue and become faster. If I draw on some of the things the other panelists have said, and kind of to link back to single window as a concept, I think that the older view of a single window is that it's kind of the post box view. You have a place where you can put all of your documents, and government goes away and does its thing. Really, what we're talking about here is kind of broad process redesign. It's not about the technology. It's a combination of the rules, the standards, the industry innovation, and there's a role that government has within that. So it's about an ecosystem. So government still has a very important regulatory objective and a single window, and getting the right information in the lowest cost to business and facilitating trade. It's a very important objective, but it's just part of a broader.
Sin Yong, and maybe Ash, and then we might, just conscious of time, and we're sort of going to bring this to a bit of a close, and I did want to leave the final, ask Vincent for some advice as the last question. Sin Yong, did you have a view on that before we pass to Ash?
Sure. Recently, I was asked the same question. You know, I'm working on a project called Trade Trust, which is the implementation of W3C verifiable credential standard. So recently, Under Secretary Lagos from the US actually visited us, and the same question was asked. So I explained that actually single window is about providing a facility by any country to facilitate the efficiency of their import and export process, right? Verifiable credential is actually a framework that allows all the single window to talk to one another, to be able to exchange data in code, without the need to invest in expensive data, building data exchange mechanism between these single window. And they are complementary, in my view. And
Well, that's
finally, she understood. I guess the next step is how Singapore can work better with the US on this area.
Well, thank you. That sounds like a compelling yes. Ash, did you have a view on that? Is it a simple yes/no answer, or?
Nothing in trade is a simple yes or no answer. I've come to learn, but I think Sin Young's now that I think, you know, if one of the objectives we have of having single windows is about the efficiency from which regulators can receive data information, then I think anything that's going to enhance that process through trust is key. And you know, to Adam's point, I think there's a lot of really good points made across this discussion, but for me, it's always that comes back to the policy first principles. You know, it comes back to the nature of the problem we're solving, the nature of the regulatory element, the nature of what we are. Why would we not let it rip and open up the border? Well, because we've got critical regulatory functions that protect our communities, that provide revenue sources, that do other elements. So, you know, we have to make sure that as we have that intervention, it is as light touch and it is as efficient as possible. And I think anything that's going to be able to support that should be and must be looked at as part of the mix. But when I think about verifiable credentials, when I think about our digital verification platform, the work we've been doing in this space, it all comes down to trust. How do we trust the information provided by the traders? How do traders trust each other? We're talking about trading goods across borders. Humans are never good at that, you know. So any technology that we can provide that alleviates that burden of trust, and whether that burden's in a paper form, whether that burden's in kind of extra costs and administration and wet stamps and whatever, that will ultimately lead to better outcomes for government and therefore the community and the harm prevention we do. But it also be beneficial for traders. You know, things become quicker and easier, and we're able to use data and information once. And that's the key for what we're looking to do in the Australian government, which is tell us once. And I think the verifiable credentials have a really big role to play in achieving that outcome.
Ash, thank you so much. Got about 3 minutes left, and I did want to throw the final question back to Vincent. Based on what you've heard today, do you have any advice for the community of interest here today, based on what you've heard and where you think we perhaps could all go next?
Sure, but oh my gosh, Peter, you got to let me respond to the single window piece
yes,
first before I say that. And Sin Young, if that was a invitation to come work with you on a project, please let me know. We can do something in the future for sure. On the single window, right now I'm working with EPA, Food and Drug Administration, Environmental Protection Agency. We also have some USDA agencies involved with us, APHIS and AMS. And one of the things that I'm trying to encourage them to do is uncomplicate their data set, because the data is so much better than what we've been getting before. And I think Adam really hit a nail on the head before when he was talking about the business aspects of things. We need to, it's not just innovation if you put technology on. It's innovation if you change the process, right? With doing that. And that's something that we all need to be looking into, and I'm trying to get the other government agencies in the US to do that with me, but also allow them to issue credentials as well. That's when it's going to start getting very powerful. In fact, even the CTPAT AEO credential, which I've recently designed, probably about 10, 11 data elements. One of the things that I've been trying to call out in it is the agency piece as well, so that if we have an expedite program for another agency, they can issue a credential in that area. I'm not sure if we're going to do that as 2 credentials or 1 unified credential. Lastly, as far as advice goes, one of the things I can tell you is that this is a very large undertaking. There has to be a political will. You need the businesses and the companies behind you to do these changes as well. They've got to be able to, excuse me for using the forest again, but they got to be able to separate the forest from the trees. And they've got to be able to understand what they're actually benefiting by. I think the long-term, the long pole view, and I realize there's going to be a long transition. It's not going to happen overnight. Maybe it's 5-7 years out for when we all start to begin these systems, is really to get to that transparent supply chain so that we can have as much trust available as the data gives us. It's not going to remove jobs. We're still going to have to do the same job that we do. I think it will allow us to be in concert with the private sector if we do this right. And I would say that one of the things that I find very intriguing is, although, Steve, I agree with you that private sector is going to have to push, it's been the government that's been leading the charge to this point. So we do need the private sector to come in and really start massively looking at all of the art of the possible in this arena. Lastly, as far as advice goes, accept that change is a constant. It's a constant universe that we're in. Don't be afraid of change, and then make sure that you test, and do more testing. I believe in baby steps. These cycles of development can happen very rapidly. Take some time, make sure that you're getting what you want out of the product. Make sure it works the way that you're expecting, and then jump in with both feet. And lastly, keep watching what we're doing over the next year to 2 years. Please follow and support what we're doing, because I think that this will really turn into a global system. And ultimately, if we want to build or even start to think about something called an international single window, this is the system that we need to do it with. And that's going to be the road to getting there, because it's got all of the basic foundations there that we can start actually having that discussion. So I'll leave it at that, Peter. Thank you again.
Vincent, thank you so much for that wrap. I'm going to pass back to Diane. Could I just pass on my thanks? It was an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be able to speak with you all today. So back to you, Diane. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to I know we haven't got a lot of time, but just quickly, I'm an exporter and I have exported for a long, long time. I'm also chair of the Export Council of Australia, which has a large number of members and member groups that we represent. Exporting is interesting. I've been doing it a long time. I started with a computer, not even a computer, a typewriter and a telex machine and paper, Vincent, and carbon paper as well on top of that. We've come a long way, and I don't expect that we're going to be able to do this, as everyone has mentioned, in 5 minutes or even in 5 years. And I think Daniel will probably agree that it has to be in bits as we go along. It can't be just one overall change that's going to happen, but it is happening, and it has happened over the years, and people will move with the changes. We need to do it correctly, we need to do it smartly, and we need to do it in a way that brings everyone on board, including government and industry, not just government expected to do it. It's really important. My ideal dream would be to have, as Vincent said, an international single window, which means that everything I move from Australia to anywhere in the world or vice versa is already cleared and checked and everything before it actually gets to the border in the other country. That's the ultimate aim. But there are lots of things, and I think the governments like Sin Yong and Vincent will have their needs from that perspective, with other goods coming in. As Vincent said, the border is the key. That's the important bit. Daniel and Ash will very much be working on a single window, not the single window, but the STS and the border areas that need to manage that. There's a lot of work, but it's all happening, and I think that's what I'm really keen about, that we need to embrace areas like verifiable identifications. We need to look at data exchange and data interoperability, but we need to do it in a way that brings everyone on board, and we need to do it with different levels of capability. I think, Adam, Steve, your comments on the standards and the work that you're doing, Steve, in the UN EFAC area are really, really important. We all need to work together. Thank you. Wonderful speakers. Vincent, very much appreciate you coming on board for this at the timing as well. And Sun Yin, thank you very much. Sin Yong, I should say, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter, for your facilitation. There are a few questions in the question box, which I believe that we might be able to get back to individually in some way on that. There's a slide on the screen now. If you'd like to become involved with NG Tag and know more about this and have more conversations, please contact NG Tag. There is a website, or there's a scan QR code. Please do that. We welcome any interaction, involvement, discussions, everything. We really look forward to having you on board. Thank you. Have a great day.